There we go. Over to you, Steve. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks, Andy, and some very interesting people on this call. I give a lot of these talks, not only this one, but a couple of others, and you'd be surprised that you get some really interesting people on. So this is brilliant. Thanks very much. I've got to do this all again tomorrow, actually, as well. I've got my friend Ian on, and perhaps one or two others. So a quick bit about me. I'm G3ZPS, an original G3 call holder like Ian, G3ROO. I'm right at the end of the G3s. They ran from about 1946, 47 to 1971, started off at G3AAA and ended at G3ZZZ. So I'm pretty near the end. I was 16 when I got the call. So if you work a G3 and they haven't been reissued, I'm one of the youngest because I was near the minimum age, which is actually 14. But of people on the air, there aren't that many G3s from the original issue. I wanted a G3 when I was at school, and I was desperate to get a G3 because they were the people I was listening to on the radio. So I qualified as a professional RF design engineer in the 70s. I worked for the government, and then I went to work for the Met Police to do some clever stuff with all their comms. And I think that's, I've given you that lecture called 999 Emergency last year, I think it was. I'm a fellow of the IET, which was the IE. I'm on the committee of Cray Valley Radio Society up here in Southeast London, which is one of the biggest clubs that meets. We still meet, in one place in our Scout Hut. I think we're 135 members at the moment, so it's a big club. And I'm in VMAS, Vintage Military and Amateur Radio Society. I'm going to talk about KW Electronics. I'm not going to mention every single bit of gear they ever made. So if I leave something out and any of you have got a favourite piece of gear and I left it out, it's not because I forgot it, it's because for brevity, we've got the can't talk about every last nut and bolt that they made. It's about an hour and 20 minutes, this. So let's just, give a warning to you. If you get into this, it's not so much to collecting, but restoring and buying up old gear. Ian's got a lot, I know, because I've been to his house quite a few times. But it can get out of hand if you're not careful. If you think, well, that's a nice, I want one of those, and then you want another one. This might be your ideal shack with an Icom IC70 something or other, and a laptop and a power supply and a microphone. That's great. If that's your ideal shack, then that's super. But look away now, because things can get out of order pretty quickly. This is George, W9EVT. Look George up on QRZ. George's entire collection of mainly vintage ham radio gear is in several rooms at this massive outbuilding. And George is just, I think it's over 1,000 bits of gear he's got. I've got about 40 complete HF stations, so I don't come anywhere near George. But, if you do start getting into this collecting like things can get pretty out of hand. So there's George. Look up George. He's got a fantastic QRZ page. Well, I'll get to talk about KW Electronics. And where do we start? Well, there were two main players in KW Electronics, and we can't deny it, but their formative years really came through one thing, and that was the Second World War. The Second World War was the first war where really HF and VHF technology were an absolutely critical element in the conflict on all sides of the conflict. There was, radio in the First World War, and there was even airborne radio in the First World War, but the technology wasn't anything like as mature it was by the time we came to the Second World War, and then development, of course, moved very, very quickly. So we've got everything from battlefield communications to aircraft communications. There's your classic R1155 and T1154, which are in another one of my talks, which is called old ham radio kit. Why the hell do we bother with it? And all the listening stations, and there were quite a few around our part down here in the southeast, using RCA AR88s and many other receivers, again in one of my other talks, so I won't dwell on it. And something very dear to Ian's heart, which I've built a replica of, that's a Paraset, a Spy, simple 3-valve, 80, 40 meter, 60 meter in that region, Spy transmitter and regen receiver. So any young people who were going to get recruited into the military, who had an aptitude for radio, they were going to get involved in some way and become crucial to the war effort. And of course, as we know, technology advanced very, very quickly through that period with R&D and an absolutely massive manufacturing effort. So we've got a couple of key individuals who were shaped by this period in history. And the first one, of course, is somebody some of you know, is Roland Shears, G8KW. And here's a picture of Rowley. He was born in 1919 in Barnet, which is in North London, just across the London from where I am now. And he was apprenticed to Invicta Radio and became BRS 1904 and then G8KW, licensed in 1935. So same age as me when I got my ticket, and a young man. And he was the war, of course, was in the offing. And so in 1938, Rowley joined the Royal Signals Territorial Army Reserve, and his first posting as a young man, only 19, was a Morse instructor in West London at 25 words a minute. So he was 19 years old and already a pretty good CW operator at 25 words a minute. But as you know, war broke out in 1939. And in 1940, Rowley, the young Rowley, now 21, was posted to North Africa. In 1941, he was posted to Cairo, and things got very, very interesting. And I'm just going to give one slide on this next part of Rowley's life because I find it fascinating. But it actually could spread out into several presentations, not just one presentation. But while he was in North Africa working on the broadcast, a radio, probably some sort of propaganda broadcast, he reported to his superiors in the signals that he had heard tank traffic from German tank traffic, which he believed was from Operation Barbarossa, which is the invasion of Russia. I'm not sure what frequency it was on, but apparently they thought it was impossible. It could have been at low band VHF, but they thought it was impossible that they could hear anything, direct tank traffic all the way, from Russia to North Africa. But apparently he proved them right a couple of days later, and they thought, well, this is a very bright young man. He's a good CW operator. He knows his stuff. He's very sharp. And they already had a little idea about what they could use some people like Rowley for, and he became involved in something called Cheese Network. Now, this is not Operation Cheese, which was an operation in Norway. This was something a little bit different. And really, a lot of this has only come out in the last 20 years since Rowley died. So here is Rowley in North Africa in 1941. And then this gentleman comes into play. His name's Renato Levi. And Renato is an Italian Jew who became a German agent, and was posted by the Germans to Cairo. But somewhere along the way, he became disillusioned with the German war machine, possibly because of their treatment of Jewish people, and decided to offer his services to the Brits in Cairo. Egypt was notionally neutral, but heavily under the control of the Brits, and the Germans were already getting keen on their North Africa campaign. So having a German spy in Cairo was something they wanted. However, he offered his services to the Brits to become a double agent. And the Brits began to formulate this plan, which they called the Cheese Spy Network. I don't know why it was called Cheese specifically, but I like to think it's you put the cheese down and the mice, the mice takes the cheese and moves along. So what the Brits did, security and Middle East Brits did, what they did for Renato was they invented for him to tell his German handlers a spy network. The most amazing thing about this spy network, and I'm only going to give the briefest few seconds about it, is all of it was fake. All of the people in it were fake, all of their backstories, and there were many and complex backstories. The whole lot was fake. The Brits made up over time a completely fake spy network. And names like Paul Nikozov, you think it's a joke, it's funny, it's actually quite true. That was an invented name that they came up with. What they needed were operators to send believable but pseudo fake information back to Germany, supposedly from Renato's now operating spy network in Cairo. And for that, they needed operators who could, who were good on the key, quick-witted, because the operator would have to pretend he was using homemade equipment that had been put together in Cairo, and Rowley was one of them. One of a number who passed hundreds and hundreds of fake but believable intel messages back to the Abwehr on HFCW over a number of years, many hundreds, I think 500-600. Things at times got quite deep with their operators, including Rowley, where he had to claim equipment had broken down, and the Germans had sent money through the diplomatic channels, Krugerrands, I think. And there was even talk about the award of the Iron Cross. But if it went to Rowley, he never got it. I'm sure it was intercepted. While he was doing this work, his superiors in the Royal Signals were told that he was required for the war effort and not to ask too many difficult questions. They were told not to ask too many difficult questions. The most amazing thing is that the Renato went back to Germany and was arrested for black market operations and all sorts of things. But the fake spy network carried on. At times, the Germans didn't believe it was real, and then at other times they realised they thought it was an important asset. So Rowley was involved in this and never really spoke about it much until after he died, and a lot more has come out since his death. If you want to read about it, there's a book called Double Crossing Cairo. I have one here, slightly different cover, by Nigel West, and you can see the complexity of the operation if you're really keen. He came out of the war, well, actually, before he came out of the war, he went to Germany, and he helped in the to get ham radio back on the air in Germany after the war, to formalise sort of operations, because there was a lot of clandestine and unregulated radio traffic going on. And for that, the DARC, the formation of the DARC took place, Deutsche Amateur Radio Club, and they made him member #1. And I think Ian knows that I spoke to the DARC at Friedrichshafen, and some of the older members do remember that about Rowley. So Rowley left the war, came back here to the UK in 1949 and went to work for a company called Berndept, which is down the road from me here in Erith. And still a young man, but he'd had an absolutely incredible war. The other main player was Ken Ellis, G5KW. This is a picture of Ken. I think it was just a coincidence they both had KW. I don't know whether they asked to get a call sign with KW in, whether the post office at the time allowed you to ask for your call sign. But anyway, Ken was G5KW. I know a little bit less about Ken. He joined the Royal Signals in 1939 and ended up as a major. There he is, Major K.E.S. Ellis, MBE, BSc. He worked in the Middle East for Allied Broadcasting and was awarded the MBE for his efforts. Ken was an interesting character. He cultivated and kept links with the Saudi royal family from the end of the war right through into the 70s. And the reason he's dressed like he is here in that photo, and there aren't too many photos of Ken taken around at that time, is that Ken managed to arrange for the Saudi royal family in 1950 a communications link between Saudi Arabia and France, because one of the members of the royal family had been injured in a car accident in France, and Ken did something special. Nobody seems to know quite what it was, but obviously the Saudis are very impressed with whatever Ken did, because they awarded him an honour, which is called the Royal Robes and Dagger, and there he is with his royal robes and dagger. Ken was very technically competent young man. And he was very, very keen on VHF all the way back to the war. He was very, very keen on VHF and VHF operation. He became a very big 50 megahertz operator and was a founder member of the UK 6 meter group. So we have Ken and Rowley, and they're our two sort of main players at this stage. And when we look at the ham radio market here, specifically in the UK, after 1946, the amount of kit, and it was just a staggering amount of hardware in terms of complete equipment. And if you want to see more of it, go around to Ian's house. He's got plenty of it. Huge amount came on the market and was still being sold 25 years from 1946 to 1971. It was still stuff in 1971. Incredible amount of stuff. And to young radio hams who didn't have a great deal of money, in the 50s and the 60s, this was the stuff to have, because if you could get enough pocket money together, you could buy it. And there was just tons and tons of it. That's a 19 set. And again, there's more about it in another one of my talks, but we're talking £5 or £6 there in the 60s, and great to get on top band or even 80 meters. And there's some young gentlemen using their 19 set. And there's an AR88 advertised as brand new in the 60s. A bit more than pocket money though, £87, but an incredible receiver. I've got one. I've had two in my ham radio life. £87 is a lot of money, and a bit more than the pocket money. And there was just a staggering amount of kit of parts, IF, RF amplifiers, transmitters and receivers. But much of it, especially the transmitters, needed modification. It was cheap, but you needed to get your hands dirty if you wanted to get on the air with it. You could buy receivers off the shelf, general coverage receivers, which would cover the ham bands, but transmitters, they normally needed a bit of work. So you're in there with the wires and a mess in your bedroom. Off-the-shelf transmitters at this period were quite few and far between. We'll cover them in the next slide. American gear became available, but at quite a high price. So off-the-shelf receivers were pretty readily available here in the UK. In the late 40s and into the 50s, I've just got a picture of it. An Eddystone 840 there, but there were quite a number. Or you could buy a surplus receiver like an AR88 or an 1155, and there were loads of others. Not really got time to talk about those in our chat. This is Bill Knott, G3BM. G3BM. I put him in here because he's got a station which shows what you can do if you had a lot of cash in the 50s. Bill was a millionaire. His company made caravans. There's a Pathé video on YouTube. If you put G3BM millionaire into Google, you'll find him. What Bill has got there is some Collins gear over on the right, bought from the US, and a Collins gear in the middle there. I think some 75 series receiver. It's got an AR88. It's got a lab gear on the left. But the thing about the Collins gear, and we'll see it in a couple of slides' time, it was fantastically expensive. There is a funny bit in this video, if you watch it, where they say that Bill has got a hobby, which is normally to preserve schoolboys and teenagers. How things have changed now with the age profile of ham radio. But mostly young hams in the 50s and 60s cheap kit had to be surplus. As you could buy from the US, and it was a lot of money. So around this time in the 50s, commercial off-the-shelf transmitters started to appear. This is a Panda transmitter. They made a few, but it's 97 pounds. Now, here, the UK sort of income rate at the time varied 500 to 800 pounds a year. You were doing really well if you earned £1,000 a year. You were a head teacher. So 97 pounds for a transmitter was a lot of money. However, as families young families started to appear, and remember that the people who've been involved, like Rowley in the early 50s, they weren't particularly old, 30, 40 years old, but they started to get a bit of disposable cash, and companies started to pop up thinking we could sell off-the-shelf gear that didn't need a lot of modification, and radio gear. Not always cheap, but there was an emerging market for it. So that's £97, 2,400 approximately today's money, just for a transmitter. But you've started to see the emergence of buy some black boxes and you've got a station that didn't have loads of wires, and you know, you can actually put something together off the shelf. And Rowley and Ken had a bit of an idea, and their idea was basically to get in on this, get on in this market. Which they thought they could do. I'm not sure if they did a business plan, as we would all do now, but in 1956, around about January the 5th, they incorporated a company called KW Electronics, the pair of them. And they started from Rowley's house, selling whatever they could get hold of, or something, or parts that were simple to make. Filters were quite popular. Because TV here in the UK was in low band VHF, starting at 45 megs, and HF transmitters, if they weren't too good, could easily wipe out your neighbour's television. So filters were quite good. And they started working from Rowley's house. And here it is. It's 136 Birchwood Road, if you're really interested. I drove past it this morning on my way to get my veg from the farm shop. And I always, hello Rowley, he's not there anymore. But Rowley's family, who I know some of, remember Rowley in his shed, or a big workshop in the garden. It's quite a big detached house for this part of London, Kent. And they started in his garage in the back of his house, in his garden. And it's a DIY operation, really, with two guys. Maybe they had some guys helping them. A DIY operation, getting a small company, KW Electronics, off the ground. But Rowley and Ken, Rowley, we think particularly, wanted quickly to expand. The market looked like there was room for them to move into. So Rowley started, we don't quite know how he made this connection. He started a relationship with a company, an Italian company called Geloso. Geloso, there they are on the left. They made all sorts of stuff. They made gramophone, hi-fi, or early hi-fi. They made TVs. They made public address systems. They made radios, and you know, all the sort of home electronics, and quite a diverse company. But John Geloso was at I1JGM. He had the same thoughts as Rowley, I guess, in Italy. Couldn't you start making off-the-shelf ham radio gear? So he did. And this is some Geloso ham radio gear. The receivers, the a G209, the transmitter, a G212. And Rowley became an UK agent for, in 1957, he became a UK dealer for the Geloso company. And you'll see why in a couple of slides. He saw some opportunities here. So in 1957, they started their advertising in the UK magazines. And at the top there, you can see they're already thinking about transmitters. Yeah, they've made the filters, as I mentioned earlier, to stop your 20-meter operation wiping out your TV if you're in London, which was on 45 megahertz from Alexandra Palace initially, then Crystal Palace, which is three times 20 meters, and your neighbour's TV might start playing up. So build your own receiver. with parts from Geloso, buy bits. He's got bits there, pi tank switch coils, a complete transmitter, 65 guineas, the receiver, 79 guineas, and a few other bits, and the aerials and that. So Rowley had already started buying in stuff from Italy, including some of the parts, which is crucial to the next part of our story. That's mine. That's a filter, channel 1, 45 megs, BBC channel 1 as it was. It was only one channel back then. And that's a filter to notch that out. You put it outside your transmitter, and there's a notch in that area to suppress the harmonic. And he made aerials. They were already thinking about building AM transmitters, and they made SWR bridges like this. The more astute among you might spot they've got rather modern connectors on. Rowley actually quite like these. They're called Belling-Lee connectors. In my business, RF engineering, we called them 3dB attenuators because they're really rather grotty, but they were cheap. And that's what Rowley and Ken like, cheap. So in 1958, this rather interesting advert pops out. This is a thing called the Geloso signal shifter. And what it is, it's the VFO part of an AM transmitter. You don't need much to make an AM transmitter. We didn't need it back then. It's the VFO part that gives you all the ham bands, and the complete thing with a power supply could drive the output valves of your transmitter, which you can then modulate with an audio system and make an AM transmitter. So a lot of the hard work is done if you use these, and they were available from Geloso in Italy off the shelf. So if you bought one, you were well on the way to be able to make a usable ham band amateur radio transmitter. And Rowley reviewed these this thing in just go back one. Rowley reviewed this in Shortwave magazine in 1958. It reviewed this thing and said how wonderful it was. Of course, he was selling them, and then he came up with this this picture. And if you read it, it says suggested layout for a cable cabinet or tabletop transmitter using this VFO unit. There it is in the middle. Got my mouse to show you. You can see it anyway. There it is in the middle here. And then all the other components you need to make your AM transmitter around it. And he suggested layout. Well, I thought that's very interesting because I'm now going to show you the inside of a Geloso transmitter of the same period that Rowley had sold some of. There's the inside of it. Spot the similarity? Well, it's the same, isn't it? So now what Rowley and Ken have got, they've got the heart of the transmitter in the middle, and they've got a chassis layout. So you can change the component values and the valves maybe, but you've got a lot of the hard work done for you. So there it is. That's a Geloso transmitter. So Rowley was already thinking about building. Is it a copy? It depends what your definition of a copy is. So a lot of the initial work was done for them. And they duly brought out an AM transmitter in 1958 called the KW Vanguard. There it is. It's one of them. And initially available as a kit, not quite a direct copy, but the basic layout the same. Sold from option as a kit, sold from the 50 watts for a single 6146, I think is in it. Carrier, proper AM modulation called plate and screen modulation, so it sounds pretty good on the air. Went through a few changes in its life, but it had quite a long life, and there's the kit price. Quite a 57 guineas, quite a competitive price, and an 8-year production run right up to 1966, and there's loads of them still on the air. When we have AM days here, there's loads of KW Vanguards in use. A very long production run, really, 8 years, well into the 60s. And there, that dial in the middle of it is Geloso, and he got Geloso, or over here he put a KW badge on. I don't know whether he changed it or whether he added it and glued it over the top here, but basically it's very, very similar to the Geloso transmitter of the period, but adapted and made here just down the road from me. So they were off and running, and they got into a film. There it is on the left. the KW Vanguard, alongside the Eddystone receiver on the right, which I showed you earlier. Not the same receiver, but there's a station. And those of you that know, have seen a few of my presentations before, will know that this is from a film, and it's from the beginning of the first James Bond film, Dr. No, where the secretary operative is in Jamaica, and she's calling London and goes off the air because she gets shot. And there's a KW Vanguard. If you look at it carefully, stop framing, it's on 20 meters, and she appears to be tuning it with the PA tune control. So I didn't get everything right, but then that's a nerd, isn't it, like me looking at it. So quickly, they now started realizing they had a success on their hand in only a few years, really 2 or 3 years. They started expanding the company. They brought out what could be used, this is mine, a mobile version of the Vanguard called the Valiant, and it's basically a KW Vanguard without a power supply built in it. It's still heavy. It's got a big modulation transformer in it, so it's not a lightweight thing. So in your Consul or Vauxhall Cresta at the time, it probably would have pulled the parcel shelf off, but you could use it early AM mobile, 50 watts again. Sounds great, my one. Sounds really, really good. Separate power supply, no switching at all. It's a Vanguard without a power supply, and it could be used mobile. Quite nice, not very big, and I really like it. I've got a separate power supply for it. A great little transmitter again. It's got that Geloso VFO in it. Same one. They overreached themselves a bit, KW, by bringing out the thing that I've called the Beast, which belongs, this particular one belongs to my friend Guy, G0UKN, who's been a big influence on me in terms of collecting, working on KW gear, and between us we've got nearly everything they ever made. They overreached themselves a bit, KW, with this thing in 1960s called the KW Victor, and what it basically is, it's a KW Vanguard on steroids. It's just a 120 watt version of the KW Vanguard, so it's bigger, very, very heavy because the power supply is built in, quite expensive, and for whatever reason, it's a bit like the Heathkit DX100 and others around at the time, but for whatever reason, it didn't sell very well in large numbers. I don't know if that was reliability or whether it was just a bit too expensive, a bit too heavy, and a bit too large, but they didn't sell them in large numbers. There are a few about. That's my friend Guy's one. We used it this year with an Eddystone receiver on top, a typical station from AM station 1960. But they sort of overreached themselves with that a little bit and didn't sell that many. So when they come up, they are quite rare. Top Man was very popular here as well, which a few people on this call know. And Rowley never really broke into the mobile market like Kodal did, which is in another one of my presentations, little Kodal transmitters. But he made this thing called a KW 160, didn't cover 80, just 160. Power supply built in, 10 watt input, little AM transmitter. It's quite small and dinky, all in one box, just the power supply is built in. But for some reason, and this is a theme that runs right through Rowley and Ken and their cost saving. Again, by the way, yeah, it looks very much like a copy of a bit of a Geloso on the front there. The cost saving runs right through this, and I have no idea where Rowley did this, but instead of using a normal output valve in this transmitter, he put a TV valve in there called a PL81. And the only reason I can think of is that it was far cheaper than what would be a more conventional valve, like a 6BW6 or 5763, because the PL81's got a different heater voltage, and it had to, Rowley had to get the contractor to wind another heater winding on the transformer, I assume. But one way or the other, the cheaper valve, offset by a little bit by having to wind another winding on the transformer, it must have worked out cheaper than using a more expensive valve. So it's a little valve with a top cap, not very big. I've changed the one in mine. It makes no difference. So it's obviously 6 watts is all you're going to get out of it. But sounds great, little transmitter. So Rowley and Ken were clearly looking at 160. So AM was trundling along nicely. KW were going really well, and they heard about this began to become aware of this SSB, mainly coming out of the US. Collins, Drake, and a company called Central Electronics in the USA had started building and selling off-the-shelf SSB equipment, and realizing that there's probably going to be the future of HF radio communications around the world. Rowley and the team thought they would have to get in on this SSB on this SSB technology. So at the Radio SGB Hobbies exhibition, God, don't we wish we had one of those now? In 1958, they brought out a bit of kit in prototype form. This is it, the first British SSB transmitter, never one to for understatement. The KW Viscount, always with a V, always with a V. 80 to 10 meters of 500 watts peak input. Oh, that was, you know, that was something. We've got no idea what happened to the KW Viscount. It never went into production. One of the reasons is probably more than one it didn't go into production, is it didn't use a crystal filter method of generating SSB. It used a thing called a phasing network, which an American company, Central Electronics, have been using. And if you get it right, your SSB sideband suppression is really, really good. But I don't think they could get it right. Needed quite close tolerance components. And that maybe the size, the weight of 500 watts peak input, or maybe it just didn't work very well. Or there was not a lot of interest at this exhibition. Let's face it, in that period here in the UK, everybody was probably, nearly everybody was using AM. It never made it. It was canned. The whole project was canned. So they went back to the drawing board, knowing probably in their hearts that SSB was not dead and its time was going to come pretty quickly. And it was more than 2 years before they came up with another product. And it was around this time that Ken left the company. We don't know exactly why they had a falling out. He was very interested in VHF, but Ken moves out of the picture around this period. And Rowley was not particularly interested, well, actually not interested at all in VHF. So they brought in another designer, G3EVV, here is Fred Hill, and with others in the company, they designed a new transmitter called the KW Viceroy, a crystal filtered, very simple crystal filtered SSB transmitter. They, from this period, 1959 through to 1966, they produced about 5 variants. It's quite confusing, which I won't bore you with. Mark 1, 2, 3, and 4, but there was a 3A, so I count that as 5. And they kept tinkering with the design. The early ones didn't have lower sideband on 40, it was upper sideband, and I had one. And it meant that you could mix upper sideband 40 to get lower sideband 160 meters SSB with an addition of 1 valve. And they were quite large initially with a huge separate power supply. Gradually changed the design and made them a little bit more manageable. Not really that more manageable, to be honest. Still the boat anchor style. This is my one, a late one called a Mark IV with a separate power supply. They made a companion linear around this time. Here it is, KW500. It's got an 813 valve in it, which is probably the valves in the transmitter that never made it off the ground. So maybe some of the work they did was not entirely wasted. So the KW Viceroy, great SSB transmitter, pretty classic, 26146 is 180 watts PEP, all the rage at the time, and sold very, very well. Again, Rowley and the team wanted to get in on the receivers. They were selling a lot of receivers from abroad, from the US mainly, and they had a few false starts. They advertised for a thing called the KW55. It never happened. They made a receiver called the KW76. This is my friend Graham G3XTZ's one, which we think was a companion mobile receiver to go with the little KW Valiant. There's no power supply built into it, separate power supply. And it looks a bit like a Drake receiver, the 1A Drake receiver, call it American Americans call it American mailbox format. It stands up like an American mailbox. Just have a little flag on it. Didn't make many of those. I'd love to have one. My friend Graham's got one and he won't sell it to me. But finally, around this period, they came up with the KW receiver that they could sell under the KW name and not bought in. It's called the KW77. Here it is. I've got two of them. There was a Mark 1 and a Mark 2, as well as other design slight changes, which make it very difficult to restore them and know that the circuit diagram matches what you've got. Big slide rule dial, triple conversion on sub bands, filters are LC, a bit like a Drake R4B. So you can have very bandwidth all the way from AM down to CW without any crystals. The IF is at 50 kilohertz, the last IF, and I've got two of them and they're great. Bit big and heavy, but great received, great fun. So they moved to a new factory, KW, in Dartford, which is not far from where I'm sitting right now. And typical of everything having over V in it, and I don't know why that is. The Vanguard works. Rolling the team moved into, here it is, just down the road. It still looks pretty much like that today. You can see if you look carefully on your screen, it says KW Electronics at the top on that building. And you can see the antennas, of course. I think that's Rowley's office there. I used to have a friend just behind there called Paul G4BXT, sadly dead now. When I was a young hand, before I was even 20, I used to go to KW's on a Saturday morning with him. They knew him and they got to know me. And they were very good to us. They let us play with all the shiny gear and never threw us out, that I remember. And I still walk past it frequently. Obviously, it's long gone now, though the buildings are still there. KW did have another facility just up the road from here. But now they had room. They had proper like small works, and they could branch out and look at new products. It was a time of expansion. So another bit of gear appeared on the scene in 1959, and it's this, the KW N2, the Collins KW M2. The world was really changing quickly now, and coming out of the KW M1, which Collins made, which was quite a big transceiver, didn't look particularly sexy. Collins came up with this, the KW M2. There were others around, but this was sort of the new concept of an SSB transceiver to aspire to one knob. A transceiver, as we would know and understand, anybody these days tune one knob tuning. Other companies had started styling similar, but Collins became the leader. They sold these to the military. A very high level of engineering, and Collins, I covered Collins in another presentation. So, and they expanded this out into another line called the S line, a whole range of transmitters and receivers, which I haven't got time to cover. That's what they sort of look like with their companion power supply, the KWM2. And a new standard, really. Now, very expensive. It's quite hard to find out how much they were if you brought one into the UK. The magazines have all got price on application. They were even very, very expensive in the US. And I've looked at some of the price lists, you know, the $1,200 to $1,500 region in the mid 60s, which £600 or £700, £12,000, £13,000 a day. So even in the US, you find in some of the ham radio magazines, there's no Collins adverts. They were pretty expensive, and certainly expensive if you bought them brand new into the UK. But it was a thing to aspire to because it looked sexy on the table, no loads of wires everywhere. And if you had a bit of gear like that, you were on the air with, you know, a couple of boxes, maybe 3 boxes, but it looked really good. And Rowley and the team were really taken with it. And they looked at it and they must have, I'd love to have been in the room, they must have had a bit of a thought process, and this was really critical to the way the company went. They must have sat around and thought, I wonder if we can make one of these, something like this. and knock it up in a shed here in Kent and make it really, really affordable. And they must have, just set themselves a goal, as you would in any modern company. A ridiculous idea, but could you do it? So the college is professional level engineering. The handbook is thick. Every aspect of the circuit is documented in great detail, accurately, and how it works and every component. And they must have looked at this whole package and thought, can we make something way, way cheaper here in Dartford in Kent? It looks really cool, doesn't it? So they looked at the topology, and I won't bore you with it too long. This is the topology of the receive side of a KWM2. The front end is slug tuned with inductors that moving with slugs that move in coils. It only covers 200 kilohertz of each hand band. So if you want to cover 10 meters, you need quite a few crystals. You can't cover 14 or 10 or 20 or even 80 meters because it won't fit into the 200 kilohertz. So that's a bit of a limitation. And that goes into a broadband first IF and then a mixer and then a thing called a PTO, a permeability tuned oscillator, a complicated mechanical beastie, stable and linear and nice readout. And that all goes into a mechanical filter at 455 kilohertz. Sorry, I've lifted it out. It's a Collins mechanical filter, which is the heart of the radio. And then a product detector, and you've got audio. So that's the topology on the receive side of a Collins KWM2. And they must have sat down, not with the computer, obviously, and where can we save money? Well, the first thing we can do is we get rid of all this complicated front end and just touch some coils and a variable capacitor, a pre-selected type arrangement. So it gets rid of a load of mechanical complexity. We can get rid of this PTO thingy because it's quite complicated. A slug moving up and down side a coil of wire. It's mechanically quite a complicated thing to build. Maybe there was a licensing issue, I don't know. Get rid of that. We'd never be able to buy Collins mechanical filters, so we can get rid of that and use something else. But the rest of it, why couldn't it be made much, much, much cheaper? And of course, you know where I'm going. They did. They went to work. And they produced something, and here it is, the fledgling KW2000, Project 2000. This is the press photograph. We know that because the photographer is just down the road from me here. And one of my friends raided their archives from 1962, 63, and we found the press cutting. That's it, signal 6146, and this is the actual prototype. No CW or CW filter. Well, it can operate CW, no CW filter. No AM capability. Must have really upset some of the AM, the AM types. Pretty poor dial readout, 2 kilohertz if you're lucky, and that's if you're sitting in front of it, not very good. And the mechanical filter was brought in from Japan. It's called a Kokusai mechanical filter, and it's a little mechanical element with them. Piezo or magneto restrictive transducers at each end, and it vibrates it, and you get a lovely pass band, SSB pass band at 455 kilohertz. And when brand new, worked absolutely great and made a lovely little transceiver. Even 6146, unlike the Collins, only 90 watts. So there it is, very, very simple, elegant. I wish they'd kept it like that. And they took a slightly uprated prototype of that there it is, to the Radio Communications Exhibition in London in 1963, and it won a silver plaque. And there is the press cutting from the local paper here, and it says, Mr. Shears, who lives in Wilmington, will be flying to Moscow shortly, where he hopes to receive orders from the Russians for the prize-winning equipment. Didn't know what would be happening when I wrote this presentation at the end of last year. And then he's also going to Stockholm. So already Rowley was thinking, maybe he could flog this thing commercially, probably at a much lower price. And it was quite an innovative product. There's no denying it was an innovative product. And this was an early production or early pre-production one. Looked slightly different to the one we saw earlier. And it hit the market in 1964. And he got it at, I think it was their target price point of £199. So still a bit of money for your average worker, but way cheaper than anything else, Drake or Collins at the time. Well, it's power spine. It looks pretty cool, doesn't it? I think it looks great. There it is. He added things like, well, we've got them on the next picture. And this is one of my two. I've got two of those early production ones. This is one of my two on my dining room table. I was lucky enough to buy a pair of them a few years ago. He put in 160 meters, which the Collins didn't have and the Drakes didn't have, not the transceivers anyway, because we love top band over here. And he put in a thing called IRT and ITT, which is where you can tune the receiver or the transmitter separately to the VFO because the thing's going to drift, because they did. So it's like working split just over a few kilohertz. So an innovation, Rowley and the team said. And they managed to squeeze Vox in at the last minute, a bit of a bodge. And surprisingly small and light, this early version, even today. We call them duck eggs because they were duck egg blue. Selectivity pretty good. Receiver wasn't very good on 40 meters in Europe back in the day because of the terrific broadcast stations above 7.1 after dark. Absolutely terrible. And 10 meters was the thing was a bit deaf, and this was all brought about by really cost cutting in the design of the front end. And mobile, if you use it with its mobile power supply, it could drift quite a bit because the heaters ran off the 12-volt battery, and when you put your foot down with your old car, the heater voltage changed, and the VFO heater voltage made the VFO drift, and you moved up the band. But they were often running with a British-built transceiver at a very, very good price. They use a rather innovative construction technique where they piled all the components sticking up, or sticking down, if you know what I mean, but if you take it apart, it's sticking up, and meant they could get the valves quite close together, which is what made the thing quite small. And it makes repair quite interesting, not impossible, but they also use some fairly cheap components. The cheapest resistors and the cheapest capacitors, a lot of them, which is fun when you come to restore them in the 21st century. But it was all cost cutting again. Keep the price down if you can. So it was the KW2000 was a success and a big hit from 1964. So what do you do when you're expanding your little company? You go for an upgrade. So Rowley now decided to rename some of his gear and make it into a line, which he called the G line, which is a homage to Collins and their S line. And now they do look like Collins. They've got the same wraparound case and bezel. And they went for an upgrade to the 2000A, but they kept the earlier version in production alongside it for a year or two. From 1965-66, they kept the earlier one in production because it was smaller, a little bit lighter and lower power, probably better for mobile. The KW2000, and now it really does start to look like the Collins, and they improved the chassis layout. But apart from that, that's what it looks like. That's one of mine, and very much Collins-like, with a flip-up lid and the 3-tone grey, dark grey front, mid-grey case, light grey, very light grey, cream bezel, and now they call it the G line. They tried to, Rowley and the team tried to address the problems on 40 meters by making the RF gain into a front end attenuator, very crude, because I think at the time people as they sold, people in the UK specifically, and probably if they've sold any in Europe, started to complain that on 40 meters the thing was unusable after dark, and on some of mine they're still not very good after dark, because above 7.2 there's still quite a lot of mainly China, isn't it, China radio broadcasters. Rowley brought out and the team brought out a commercial derivation of this radio called the 2000C and the CA, which is really just a 4-channel radio telephone based on the KW2000 design, which they could sell them in the commercial world as just a 4-channel HF SSB radio telephone. And we'll see a picture of one of those a bit later because it pertains to a later part of the story. And we're moving into the heyday of KW with not a lot of competition at their price point in the UK. And the attraction all the way through the next couple of slides is that you could come down here to Dartford and you could go and buy it and you could speak to the people who made it. And Rowley would even, you know, take your radio in for repair, and he might even do it on the spot. He always had an eye to helping others out, and apparently he helped some of the pirates out. One of the pirates in the Thames Estuary, Radio 390, 390 meters. Apparently he helped them with procure a broadcast transmitter and some aerial rigging on the sea faults in the middle of the channel here, between Kent and Essex, the sea faults. So you know, it's quite community minded, really. Probably not many of you will remember this, but there was a cartoon strip called Modesty Blaze in the paper in London here for the Evening Standard, and she was like a female James Bond, and he managed to get a KW 2000A into this cartoon in the Evening Standard. And I think it was syndicated elsewhere in the world, so I don't quite know how he managed it. And not that anybody who read the paper would have any idea what it was, but there's a KW 2000, you know, in this strip cartoon. So successful 60s moving along, and keep innovating if you can, even if you don't innovate by much. So the next innovation, really, it wasn't much of an innovation, really, was the KW 2000B, probably the biggest seller. Slightly better dial layout. The earlier ones had a very quirky dial, which I won't bore you with, but they're not very sloppy and a little bit difficult to use. This used a more conventional Jackson slow motion drive and a slightly better chassis layout. Not much, very little difference. Look, it was not a great deal of innovation, really. Restyled slightly with the meter and everything, and they smoothed out some of the bumpy AGC, but it really only added 1 or 2 components. They did make an external VFO for some of these 2000B radios, but it's quite a rare item. The readout was still very, very small, and Drake had already got 1 kilohertz readout by now, and I'm afraid the KW wasn't very good. It's 2 kilohertz readout, very narrow. It sold very well, and it was probably their best-selling transceiver. But the competition was beginning to grow, drip at first, but the early Yaesu, Swan, and Trio, or Swan American, started to sort of begin to put gear on the sale in the UK at this £200 to £300 price point. But the UK build and service of their components, of their products here, kept the sales up. But it was the beginning of just the very beginning of the signs that things might be changing. There were queues. There were stories of queues here, queuing up to pay cash for their 2000B. So they were a bit like the Icon 7300 of the day. And back in my day on Top Band, 1970, 71, all these slightly older hands at me had a bit more money. They all had these. KW took on apprentices around this time. Oh, that's my 2000B on my dining room table. Very clean example, although I've resprayed a lot of it, but a big seller and still little competition. So they started to take on apprentices around this time in the 60s, and it looks pretty primitive to me, the working conditions. Again, an eye to cost saving, using apprentices. There might have been some government financial support for them. So it's cheap labour, isn't it? They get trained and you get stuff built on the cheap, and they're working on a KW receiver there on the right. But it looks fairly primitive when you compare it with some of the production lines of other companies, but that's the way it was. And they really kept on bringing out new products. So they weren't particularly, there wasn't a lot of innovation in the technology. That's a KW201 receiver. There at the top, I've got one of those. And the KW Vesper at the bottom, but a cheap transmitter, the linears. And the 2000A, there it is, gone up a little bit now, £220. There's a KW Vespa I've got, that's my one. That's just a transmitter. And yet more cost saving, interestingly. KW decided to put the power supply for the KW Vespa in an impregnated cardboard box. Here it is. It became a bit of a running joke. You know, if it catches fire, it'll burn your house down because it's made of cardboard. It's impregnated fiberboard cardboard, but it's cardboard, isn't it? And you know, you really want a power supply built with a cardboard cover over it. It's metal underneath, but everybody joked about it. You know, who would do such a thing? What company would cover their power supply up? All the, you know, everything's, you know, if you take the top off, you get your hands in amongst all the components, but that's what they did. There were two versions of it, a medium and a high power version. And a nice receiver here, KW201. It's really only a KW2000 receive parts and not a great deal of innovation in the design. And there's the linears. A lot of the linears have endured until now. They've endured for quite a long time because the power supply is a weak point. The transformer, it's not, again, not particularly a cutting edge design at the time. 572B valve linear. Loads of other companies were doing them, like Heathkit and Yaesu with their FL2100. But they look pretty good. They match and they work well. And they made 600 watt version. I have both 601 kilowatt input linears, one valve or two. Early ones that didn't transformer problems because they were some of the components were, they used the cheapest they could get. And successful, I had a guy on 40 meters today talking about the one of these KW Easy Match, a balanced tuner, Z match arrangement. Loads of these were sold because open wire feeders were quite popular. These ones didn't easily tune long wires. You could, but they were really best off as balanced antenna tuners. There it is, KW Electrics Dartford, sold loads of those. I had a slightly better one with a power meter built in, some of them, which would work with long wires as well. KW 105, 107 and 109, that's one of mine. I think it's one of mine. And they're quite highly desirable now because they use quite good quality products when you compare them to things like the MFJs. If they're in reasonably good condition, they're quite desirable and they go for quite good money. The higher numbers, like the 109, handle a bit more power and a bit more desirable than like the 105. I also have one of those. But you see them on eBay and at ham rallies. I can't remember if there was one at Dover. But they do pop up from time to time and they're quite desirable because they're pretty good at what they do. And antenna matching is the same now as it was then. So they also wanted to break into the American market or an export market. I'm not quite sure what they were thinking. And came up with this thing at the top there called the KW Atlanta. Another interesting radio, high power, claimed 400 to 500 watts input. But guess what? I borrowed the design. Well, they really did borrow the design from this because I've got the handbook of the radio that they borrowed it from. Designed for export, it says, claimed 500 watts input. But it is there's my KW Atlanta, looking very nice. I use it regularly. But it is a copy of the Swan 500. If you look, the giveaway is the dial. If you can see the dial in the middle, there's the Swan 500. The dial in the middle there is blue, which tells you which frequency band to read out from, depending on which band on the dial to read out from, depending on which band you're on. The blue relates to 20 to 15 meters and 40 meters, I think. And if you look back to my KW Atlanta, you see that it's got the same blue in the middle there because the frequency mixing scheme is identical. There are only a few component differences. I've got both. I've got the schematics of both. it was just built cheaper. And what you do when you copy something is you end up with the same limitations of the thing you copy. And the Swan had some limitations, very poor dial readout on the upper bands, and could have some VFO problems. So if you cut corners there, the rig could drift quite a bit, and the Atlanta cut the same corners, if not quite a bit more than Swan did. And it's okay up to like 20 meters in the right hands. Mine has been modified to run lower power because it's got things called sweep tubes in it, which are TV output tubes, which are great. But if you don't treat them carefully, they gobble up current and then go bang. It looks like there were a few sold in the USA. I'm not sure if they did. I'm not sure how they got away with the fact that it was effectively a Swan 500. I do know, I have been told of the G3 that carried out the design work, but I'm too scared to talk to him in case it's like the mafia. You know, who wants to know? And I'm not really scared. I just haven't had a chance to. But again, it's a KW thing. Why design something brand new when you can adapt somebody else's design? And in this case, I had a fault with my KW Atlanta, and I fixed it using the Swan service manual because I looked at it and there's no difference. There's one more transistor in the Atlanta, but everything else is just made cheaper components, a cheaper layout, cheaper bits. So I need a few more slides now. They did bring out some separate transmitters and receivers. Here they are, KW202 and 204. And then now they did a bit of a bodge. They managed to open out the bands to 500 kilohertz instead of 200, but they were really shackled by the design going all the way back to the KWM2, that this was not easy to do. So they had to do some dodges to get them to use fewer crystals and cover all of the bands. Probably they wanted to cover all of 10 meters. And the only way to do that and cut down on the number of crystals you needed was to open out the bands to 500 kilohertz. But the design wasn't really made for that, and they were stuck because they copied the Collins, and they did some crude mods to get it to work. And what I find very amusing is you can't join them together to make the big transceiver like you could do with Drake gear, and Drake had been doing it for years. Again, it just was there were some design limitations which were probably there's no way around them, and in some ways one or two of them were surprising, but they brought out these separate transmitters and receiver. Really, again, only a split of the transceivers into 2 bits. That's what they look like. That's not mine, but that's what they look. They're quite cool, and people, my friends, collect them. So the times they are changing. Bob Dylan, is it? Around 1970, the warning signs were getting pretty strong. The Japanese manufacturers were beginning to move in with a range of products, gradually improving their designs. And if anything personifies it of that period, to me, it's the FT101. Yaesu had made other transceivers before that, but the FT101 was one of those designs like the KW2000 that became, like, of its time, an icon. They were a good price. They were very well made, used transistors, which KW didn't, which meant when he turned it on, the receiver was on. Didn't drift too much. And it came in at the price point. It started to come in at the price point that KW had been running in. It was a one-box solution. The power supply was built in, now AC and DC built in. You had to plug it into the mains, plug it into a battery, plug it into an aerial and the microphone, and you had a complete station and you were on the air. And it was slow at first because there was still attractive to buy at that time from a UK company you could pop into and see. There were probably worries about if this went wrong, you know, would the UK importers be able to fix it and service it? And they were now sort of, you know, starting to hit that price point. The Yaesu and the others, I'm just using this as an example, quickly developed to include 160 meters because that was big in the market here in the UK, and other refinements. The FT101 started to come in via other routes, through Switzerland, through an importer called Summercamp, who brought them into the UK. And as we and they started to run at high watering production numbers, not off of a production line that looked anything like Rowley in his shed and his apprentices looked like, and very reliable. They proved to be reliable. One or two of my friends who worked for SMCs, one of my friends, Roger T3YRO, ran an FT101B or an E, and I think 20 or 30 years without a single component failure, and still with the original valves, sweep tubes, if you don't thrash them. And I think Rowley, so has been told to me, looked at these and thought that the world has shifted, it's rotated, isn't it? It's shifted on its axis for the sort of stuff that KW were making, and the leap to this was a generation beyond. So Rowley made a decision, and it probably was, we're not sure if he knew somebody in Decca, and in early 1974, for a number of reasons, not all of which I know for sure, he sold the group to Decca. It became part of the Decca group, or it was absorbed into the Decca group. And I like to think that one of the things that probably drove him at the time was that he would keep the people employed, because Decca were quite interested in subcontract manufacturing, that KW had an expertise in, subcontract building, and also they had a market which would probably be usable for their HF radio telephones, the 2000 radio telephones, which this is really the company was now, wasn't it? It was Limited Innovation. They were never going to produce an FT101, and all valve gear was starting to look a little bit out of date now once that FT101 came along. Not completely, but it was heading that way. This was the thing that Decca were really quite interested in. It's a 2000 CAT. It's a 4-channel HF radio telephone. KW had them, made them before, but this is one that used Plessey ICs in it, just valves for the output. I've got one of these. I'm running it on 80 meters. Very reliable. Everything preset. You just plug in a power supply or a preset linear, and you've got a big 4-channel 500-watt HF SSB radio station in your embassy or your oil rig or wherever you want to put it. And they started to get orders for a lot of these, which had pushed the ham radio equipment into the background, because I guess Decca thought it's a bit of a sideline ham radio. As we run to the end here. So KW continued in the 70s, but it became a story of gradual decline. Rowley the team brought out a thing called the KW 2000E, which some wags call 2000B is B for best. 2000E is 2000E for expensive. So the price is creeping up a bit here, 265. And they did the same bodge with this that they did with some of the other stuff to get 500 kilohertz coverage of each band. But again, they were shackled because they copied the Collins design. So this was the first sort of redesign of the KW, but even of the transceiver, but even then only parts of it were redesigned. Like the front end was a bit better. And if you look down there on the advert, it said that they kept the B in production because some customers prefer the excellent band spread. Well, it wasn't that excellent. It was pretty poor, actually. But if that was poor, this new E model was even worse. But they brought it out in an effort to keep some hold on the UK market. And this is my KW2000E, and the dial resolution, you probably can't see it on there easily, but it's 5 kilohertz. There's little divisions of 5 kilohertz. And on some of my Drake gear that I've got here, every division is 1 kilohertz. So it's sort of 5 times worse in the readout than other contemporary gear that was around at the time. And it's all valve. And here we are in 1972-3 making all valve HF radio gear in the UK. In another attempt to try and move forward a bit, the team added a digital readout to the 2000E, thus of course calling it the 2000D. But the technology was moving so quickly, but by the time they came up with the switching arrangements and the chip structure to make the digital readout, already it would have been cheaper to have started again and done it with fewer chips. The design was already out of date, which was, I guess, was typical of digital electronics at the time. So they only made two or three 2000Ds, where one's in Australia, which I think might have come back to the UK now. One is in the RSGB headquarters at Bletchley Park. We've had it on the air. And we think there's another one, but we're not sure where it is. And it never went into production at all. That was it. It was the last gasp because it's still got a valve VFO. Not even an FET, guys. Couldn't even do that. So I'm sure that, and only 1 kilohertz readout, which, let's face it, with SSB is not really good enough, is it? 100 hertz isn't very good, but 1 kilohertz. So they were starting to just make poor choices now. And it was never going to sell. I can't imagine it would have sold particularly well, because it probably would have been expensive. So as we move into the 70s and towards the end of this presentation, gradually the products, the transmitters, the receivers, the transceivers, they gradually drop out of the adverts. If you look through the shortwave mags and the other magazines, they gradually start to disappear. The transceivers disappeared, the receivers about 1976, 77. They just weren't selling. The competition was now hoovering up everything. So near the end in 1979, 80, they'd almost come back to where they were in 1956. Tuners, matches, antenna switch, balun, and a KW favourites, it says there, dummy load, trap dipole, Shaw microphones. So in a rather sad way, the company by the end of the 70s had pretty much where it started, and all the other stuff had sort of gradually dropped away. Rakel bought this last couple of slides now. Rakel bought Decca 1980, leaving Rowley and a few employees that he could take with him pretty much with nowhere to go. What he decided is that he would buy back, probably at a good price, all of the parts that were left under the Decca umbrella, the ham radio part of Decca. He'd buy them all and just take them all, and he took everything, so that as a minimum he could start making tuners. You could still sell the tuners and, you know, the Z matches and maybe whatever else. But as is his way, he went looking again for another company, and he landed on the American company Ten-Tech, which didn't have an agent over here, and pretty much as he did with Geloso all those years before, he formed a relationship with Ten-Tech from 1981-82, formed a new company called KW Ten-Tech Limited, and moved to Chatham, which apparently he hated. James is down in Chatham, about halfway between some of you and me, and apparently he hated it there. So Chris Ridley, yeah, GKC tells me, didn't like it very much. Chris was there. And he bought in Ten-Tech gear, and they did some modifications to it, did some assembly work, and they put a badge on it. I've got a Ten-Tech Omni here, which came from the Dover Rally. I think, well, Andy, you were there, and you saw it, I think, Ian.
Yeah.
And it's got a KW badge on it. The KW badge looks like it's been made by a secondary school craft, you know, in their craft class. It's a horrible Perspex thing painted black. Probably been bodged since, but it looks awful. I prefer the Ten-Tech logo. But they told the Ten-Tech, it's a Ten-Tech Corsair, quite a highly regarded transceiver. I haven't got one of those, unfortunately. Quite like one. I do pop up, and there it is, Jenkinsdale there. So business slowed, however, even with the Ten-Tech, because the Ten-Tech stuff was, although good, was looking a little bit tired in comparison with your FT902s and your FT101ZDs and then your FT1000s and everything else, which is all coming along. Again, the Tentec stuff, good though it was, and good on CW, sales started to slow, and there's not a great deal of it in the UK. And Rowley packed it in when he was 70 in 1989. He sold the business to a contractor, which I think he'd been working with, called HRS, who'd done subcontract work for him. But they didn't last long either. I don't know if they took the Tentec dealership with them, and they went under in 1991. So we're pretty much at the end now, and things started to come to an end. Rowley died in 2009. That's a pretty classic picture of him. And in his twilight years, his cousin Colin, who I know, I've met several times, started to collect this information about the operation, the cheese spine network, which was a pretty unknown part of his life. In fact, this book really, Nigel West, this book has only come out in the last, I think this is 10, 15 years old, maybe not even that. All of this information about the cheese spine network started to come out, and Rowley started to talk about it, and Colin has made a lot of notes. Whether he will write it into a book, I don't know. Rowley started to get memory loss problems and stayed on the air. After 2005, his health declined, and he used to tell you the same thing that he told you on the previous over, which is very, very sad. He was awarded a fellowship of the Radio Club of America, which not many people over here have heard of. I don't know if anybody else has heard of it. I hadn't heard of it, for service to the comms industry in 1990. And I said that's a pretty classic picture of him, and it's, you know, he looks like a dashing wartime sort of young man, isn't he? Fantastic. And they were a big part of thousands of us, me included, met him and the team and visited the factory, and he'd always try to help people out. He was very big on customer service. I'll try and fix it for you. And I've got letters that he personally wrote, and people wrote. So, you know, despite the cost cutting and the sort of copying of designs, he had quite an eye to good customer service. So where are we left in the 21st century with KW Electronics? Well, there's a big, vibrant collector community of several hundred of us. Just celebrated its 20th anniversary, actually, in Canada and New Zealand, Australia, UK, and a few in the US. Not many, but a few. But you can find us on groups.io. We do try and keep all the gear going. The real weak point of them is that mechanical filter I showed you about an hour ago. It's the mechanical element protected by foam inside the can, and the foam degrades over the years. You can't stop it. There's nothing you can do till you take it apart. You won't know, and it will look like that. It turns into this brown goo, which has two effects. One, it clogs up the mechanical element, and two, it allows that mechanical element to rattle inside the case, which can damage the transducers on either end or break the wire. So if you shake it and it rattles, it's probably not going to work. And they can be repaired. Some are easier than others, and you can clean them and wrap them in foam and put them back together again and get them apart. One or two of us have become quite adept at it, and that's really the only weak point. The rest is cheap resistors that they use, cheap capacitors that they use, one or two mechanical bits, switches and relays. But in general, if something's not been too abused, we can get it back on the air. I've got 10 KW2000s that are all on the air to one degree or another, within the limits that they weren't brilliant on some bands at the time. My friend Guy G0 UKN keeps inventory so that we try and keep track. And when they come into our sphere of influence, if we can find out the serial number, who owned them, where they came from. And every year in Cray Valley here in my club, we run a celebration every January. It started off a few years ago quite slowly, but it's got bigger and bigger. I'm probably partly to blame for that. And now we run from the Cray Valley Radio Society Shack in Eltham, GB8 KW, and others have come into the bandwagon now with GB KW related call signs. But we run for the weekend, celebrating the January weekend when the company was founded, and we are the closest, obviously, to the factory. As it was. KW's had two owners in the last 5 years, I think, who've managed to, excuse me, I'm getting a bit hoarse now, who managed to get hold of the name. I think they've managed to, the name is owned by somebody else, but they've managed to get a license to use it. Probably like whoever that is, I didn't know his name, wants a cut of the profits if they make anything, but they haven't really made anything. They've promised but never delivered anything. So a few kits, and even they've disappeared, and they weren't very good, poorly documented. So it's had little goes at starting up, but neither of the people who have run it in the last few years have really done anything. So I think it's dead again now. That's that's the KW GB8 KW operation this year, January, in the Cray Valley clubhouse. We've got a tower with a beam and antennas all the way up to 77s, right from 80, and we put a top bandera up. We've got the room and run all bands. And this year we ran stations theme by year from the 50s. That's me on the left with my KW Atlanta and a linear. And I've got another few radios there, but we ran 9 stations this year, not all at the same time, because you can't do that with KW gear. If you're on one band and you're listening on another band, even with the filters, they don't like the strong, they're not very good at strong signal handling on receive. And right near the end now, I've been very privileged in years gone by, 2 or 3 years ago. That's Rolly Shears' son, Richard Shears, and he holds G8 KW, his dad's call sign, and he's been very, very good. He allowed me to use G8 KW, and so I've been on 80 meters over the KW special weekend using G8 KW, and all my mates calling me and go, "No, Steve, it's GB8 KW," and I'm going, "No, it's G8 KW, because I've got permission from the license holder who's sitting here with me to use the old man's call sign." So would I have ever known, you know, when I met Rolly all that way back, 1971 or something, that, you know, 50 years later, I'd be using his call sign. Made me smile, a little bit emotional as well, but Richard's a great chap. So that's pretty much it. I'd like to thank the extended family of Rolly Shears, Colin in particular, who's not been that well in recent years. He doesn't know that I thanked him probably here. We keep in contact with a few ex-employees like Chris Ridley, GKC, and you know, they're getting fewer. The KW collector community around the world, a lot in this country. Cray Valley Radio Society, my club, have been very good in letting us take over the shack, and one weekend a year, and they publicise it a lot. My friend G0UKN in Eltham, who's a collector like me and organises GB8 KW. And between him, we've got nearly everything KW ever made. Only a few bits we haven't got. And Chris Ridley, G8GKC, works for part-time for ICOM now, who worked for KW and Decca and KW 10 Tech. So thanks very much. Hope you've got some fun and found it interesting. That's me, G3ZPS.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm Andy. I'm with a friend of Andy's on Facebook. Cray Valley Radio Society was 75 actually this year. And you can find me on YouTube. I do the odd little radio review on there, although it's mainly my music. So I'll stop sharing. And thanks very much. If you haven't fallen asleep, I've got to make a cup of tea.
Thanks very much, Steve. I really appreciate that. I feel like you've taken me on pretty much a complete journey of from you know, the early beginnings right the way through. So thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed that, Steve. It was
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. So the 2000D, that digital readout, what technology did that use?
You can look it up on the web. Peter G3ZPS, who worked for KW for a while, wrote a little article when Rolly died about the 2000D. I included it in there, but I think it used a lot of individual 7.4 series chips. And I think it was quite complicated. It was 1975, probably used a lot of TTL. I wouldn't be surprised if A, it was complicated, and B, it sucked quite a bit of power at 5 volts, probably.
Right.
But for whatever reason, it was out of date before it even made it into production. It was never going to go into production. Who wanted, you know, I just think it was, it wouldn't, it was, you know, they were beholden to Decca at that time, and they would have had to guarantee a lot of sales, wouldn't they, to put a production line in. I think Decca were thinking, no, never going to work.
Was the display LED or gas discharge?
I can't remember.
Nixie.
I
Was
don't
it
think it was.
Nixie?
No, I don't think it was Nixie tubes.
You
Well,
could
I
see
think
they
so.
were Nixie, surely.
I believe they were LED.
Yeah, I think
The one in NRC, I'm pretty sure.
I think it's those 70s gas discharge, not LEDs. What are they called? Electroluminescent displays.
Nixie.
No, it's not a Nixie, Ian.
Well, I'm sure that was Nixie.
No,
You'll have to
no.
send me the picky.
No, it wouldn't have been.
I've started a row. I didn't mean to.
Yeah, go on, Ian. Go on, mate. No, it wasn't Nixie, Ian. It was the very early.
Well, you had the 5-segment. You had the 7-segment.
It was a 7-segment.
line.
It was a 7-segment.
No, but that was a nice clean line that you could see the sort of hazy line of the gas discharge.
Well, if you want to pop up to Bletchley to the red, I'll go and have a look for you, mate.
Well, no, the picture. No, just
I know I did.
that
Yeah.
yeah.
Whatever it was, I don't. Whether we have to agree to do whatever it was never going to go into production. They only made 3, and time was called on it. If you want to read it, search for G3RZP's article on KW. Because I nicked some bits out of it. It'll tell you a bit about it. But there's not very many people around who know about it now, because the small design team.
Well, back in '75, they didn't have you only had 7-segment display, or the Decatron, or the or the gas discharge Nixie tubes. You didn't have LEDs at that time.
No, it wasn't LED display. It was whatever that 7-segment type of display.
Well, yeah, but they were filament. They were filaments, straight line filaments, nicely focused.
Oh, like that. And that was it then, Ian. That was it. That's probably what it was. But it never went into production. I could just see Decca going, no. I'll get a production line for this.
Yeah, good evening, guys.